I think you would agree with me that in the modern world, competition is so intense that you either have to be so good in your performance that you can compete in any hyper competitive environment. And the other thing you need to do is that because there's so much disruption going on, you need to be very creative and you need to innovate almost all the time in order to stay ahead of the pack. Now, this is certainly true for companies as well as for individuals. How do we maintain our stress level in such a way so as to maintain that level of activity that is productive and efficient? Well, the key to it obviously is not to live a normal life of sedentary peacefulness. Neither it is so stressful that you have to live under the influence of cortisol with all the stress-related diseases. There is a balance of stress that allows you to perform at your best, no matter what the circumstances is. Certainly, for creativity, the balance of stress is within the brain, between the midbrain and the big brain, the cerebral cortex. As you know, the stress response lies in the midbrain, where when activated, you're ready for a fight or flight response. But for creative activity, you need the action of the cerebral cortex, the big brain, especially the prefrontal cortex, where cognitive thinking, where logical thinking, and all the abilities that we have as humans reside. So there must be a balance. And we know now that if the cerebral cortex, the prefrontal lobe, where creativity resides, is active, and the midbrain, the part which is essential for your survival, when it is activated, creativity and the ability to think and produce stuff intellectually or otherwise comes from. It is this balance between the cerebral cortex and the midbrain that allows you to be at your best. So, we therefore must be able to be relaxed and yet be activated in our stress response so that this thing can happen. And you see this in this concept of what is known as a transformational leadership, where leaders are engaged with their employees to such an extent that employees are motivated and want to do better and better. In such a scenario, you find that the cerebral cortex is activated, the midbrain is also activated, and that's where productivity is at its highest. How about in conditions of competition, such as happens in sports, in the performing arts and so forth? You find that all this requires a certain amount of skill. And this skill, as has been pointed out by many people, requires hours of deliberate practice. Now, what does this term deliberate practice means? Deliberate practice means that you perform the activity so often that they become a habit. Now, what happens in the brain is that when you deliberately practice a skill, you facilitate the transmission of impulses between nerves. Beyond that, there is also a laying down of white matter in individual nerve cells. This white matter allows the facilitation of the transmission of nerve signals. And another part of the brain is involved. Below the back of your brain is a part of the brain called the cerebellum. Cerebellum coordinates our learning and our habitual activities. So, for example, if you play the table tennis game in the Olympic finals, this is what takes place. There is again a balance between the cerebral cortex and the midbrain. There is also the activation of the cerebellum, which because you are relaxed enough and yet activated enough to allow it to coordinate all the activities, you can perform very well in competition. Now, isn't that a marvel? And yet, if you are overstressed, all things break down. You remember our table tennis star in 2004, she almost became a finalist. But in the semi-finals, she broke down. She got choked by stress to the point where she lost the match with somebody who was a complete nobody. And if you look at the scores of that match, it tells you a story. Consistently, she has been performing well with scores of 11, 11, 11 throughout. And then in the semi-finals, when she was playing against this person who was not as skilled as she was, her scores was 11, 11, 11 for the first 3 sets. And then because of something that her opponent did which rattles her, her scores fell down to below 11 and she lost the match. In other words, if you succumb to stress in competition, you cannot perform. But if you can regulate your brain to be both relaxed and activated and allow it to be sufficiently balanced enough without tipping over into stress, then you can perform well. And this also explains another phenomenon you may have noticed, that you find in groups that are competing. During rehearsals, they do very well, but in the final competition, they often perform badly because somehow being in the actual finals stress them so much that this balance is lost completely. How do you regulate that? It is something I will teach you in my stress workshop. Thank you.